Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to Georgetown and to this dialogue. It's on the dignity of work, putting workers at the center of a divided economy. I'm David Beckmann, president of Bread for the World. This event has been organized by Georgetown's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. In less than 6 years, the initiative has organized more than 60 gatherings with the attendance of more than 22,000 people. This has become an important center for dialogue on the intersection of faith and politics, biblical values and public policy. And the initiative is also helping a new generation of lay faith leaders emerge. Providentially, John Carr started the initiative just before Pope Francis got elected. And so this initiative has helped us learn from the new Pope, cope with a new president, grapple with the failings of church leadership, and set directions for a better future. The Convergence Center for Policy Resolution is co-sponsoring this event. They recently produced a groundbreaking report titled Working Up. The report emerged from a cross-sector dialogue, and two of the leaders of that dialogue are on our panel tonight. Bread for the World is also a co-sponsor of tonight's event. Bread for the World organizes Catholics and Protestants all across the country to urge Congress and the President to do their part to end hunger in our country and around the world. We're encouraged by the progress that's been made against hunger and poverty, certainly globally, but also in our own country over the decades. But we think that continued progress against hunger and poverty in this country will depend on improving job opportunities for low-income people. So last year, Bread for the World published this report on jobs. It's on the table outside, and you can also, or a summary of it's on the table outside. You can also call up the summary at www.bread.org/hunger report. I was really encouraged. This report presents an array of policies, many of them that could command bipartisan support, that would improve job opportunities for low-income Americans. And we think that 2020, an election year, just may be a year in which people like us can join together and help to pass bipartisan jobs legislation. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce John Carr, who will moderate tonight's dialogue. John is the founder and director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. He previously served for 20 years as Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Earlier in his career, I noted when I looked him up, John directed the National Committee for Full Employment under Coretta Scott King. But I think John's main claim to fame is that he is chair of the board of Bread for the World. He's also one of my closest personal friends. John.
Thank you very much. For folks that are gathering in the back and are in the corners, please come up to the front. There are some reserved seats. They're reserved for you. So come on up. What's the gospel going to come up higher? So come on, Tom. Folks in the back, come on up here. Great. Well, what a turnout and what a lovely space. I think this is the nicest space at Georgetown. It's Riggs Library. It actually served as the library for the university from 1891 to 1970. It was designed by the same person who designed the Library of Congress. And while there are few less books, we think it's just as pretty. So I want to thank David for his very generous introduction. David's a Lutheran pastor. He's president of Bed for the World. We're friends, as he said. He is one of the real leaders in the Christian community and in our country, and working on poverty and hunger. And I think it's quite remarkable and frankly a signal that their annual hunger report focused on the jobs challenge. It is one of 3 reports we're focusing on tonight. Convergence, our colleagues there, have done a wonderful report called Working Up. Several of us were involved in that. We made major contributions, I thought. And the American Enterprise Institute, which Robert, as you'll learn, is about to become president of, worked with the Brookings Institution on a major study on the working class and on overcoming poverty. So again, folks in the back, come on up. There's still some seats up front. Join us. You know, when we chose this topic, we did not know if you would come for this. This is a time of crisis in the Catholic Church. It's a time of anger and division in our country. And Washington, or this capital, seems polarized and paralyzed. So would people turn out for a discussion of work and workers? So I'm going to make a very unusual pledge tonight. Tonight you will have an evening with no collusion, no obstruction, and no sex abuse discussion. That's not a comment on the Mueller report, but it's a promise we're going to focus on substance. In fact, we think there is a remarkable opportunity for the faith community, for our country and this capital, to come together around the moral, the human, the policy, and the economic imperative of putting work and workers at the center of economic life. If you think about the faith community, work is at the center of Catholic social teaching in almost every religious tradition. David mentioned Pope Francis. Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, which is an encyclical. I know several of you read encyclicals just tremendously. It's a great cure for insomnia. Actually, this one will keep you awake. It's tremendous in Pope Francis' leadership. But he said, we were created with a vocation to work. Work is a necessity, part of the meaning of life on this earth, a path to growth, human development, and personal fulfillment. We must allow people to have a dignified life through work. So this is not just a Catholic thing. In 10 days, we will mark the 50th anniversary of the murder of Dr. King. It's important to remember, he was in Memphis to stand up for the dignity of work and the rights of workers. He said to those sanitation workers, whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth. All labor has worth. So there is a moral dimension, even a spiritual dimension to work. So the religious community ought to come together. Our country ought to come together around this. In some ways, we could be lulled into complacency. The economy is growing, unemployment is dropping, but the progress is uneven. This is an economy where lots of people are moving ahead and lots of people are left behind. So we have a growing economy with growing gaps. We're going to talk about some of those gaps tonight. Race and gender and class exacerbate all these challenges, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I think in the face of those challenges, there are signs of hope. And here I mentioned these 3 documents. The Jobs Challenge from Bread for the World. They say if you want to overcome hunger, you have to focus on jobs. The American Enterprise Institute, working with Brookings, the 2 preeminent think tanks, one tends towards the right, one tends towards the left, came together working across partisan lines, ideological lines, on a study that was called Work, Skills, and Community Restoring Opportunity to the Working Class. And they presented an agenda that could get people to work together. And then the Convergence, our colleagues who are here, Rob and Russell and Stephanie and others, have worked on two reports. One that you and I were a part of is called Working Up. It's very clever, I think. That talks about mobility or the lack of mobility and the steps that can be taken to help people find a path to decent work at decent wages. And then are now focusing on workers returning from incarceration, a particular major challenge. And we'll talk about that. Not everybody is convinced that work is at the center of public and economic life. This is a headline I saw: America must divorce dignity from work. Some are saying this connection is outdated. We're going to have automation. We're going to have artificial intelligence. Maybe we'd have a universal basic income. Work is sort of outmoded. This is not the panel for those people. We will be talking about that. I'll make a confession. In my work, David's work, David is the head of the Circle of Protection with others. I've worked primarily on strengthening the safety net, and I'm proud of it. There are others in the room on more conservative persuasion who have worked on taxes and regulation, less of both. Other people have worked. My experience is work is part of the poetry of American politics, but not the policy. It's part of the rhetoric, not the reality. And we hope there are signs that that is changing. You may have thought Senator Sherrod Brown is doing a Dignity of Work tour. We had hoped that Senator Brown would join us. I explained to them that we were for the dignity of work before he was. Maybe that was not the right way to begin. But he could not be here, but we hope to have him in the future. And Marco Rubio, on the other side of the aisle, engaged him, and the two of them had sort of a Twitter feud about what kind of proposals would do best for work and workers. In my mind, right question, wrong platform. We don't need a Twitter feud. We need a real national dialogue. We need hearings. We need action. We need legislation. We need not just government, we need the private sector. We need business, labor, philanthropy, and religious groups. And so that's why we're here tonight, to have that larger public dialogue. And we are really blessed to have four remarkable people. Katie Corrigan is the Deputy Chief of Staff for the AFL-CIO, President Richard Trumka. And she is the Chief Staff Person for their work on the future of work. She also has Georgetown connections. We're very proud of her. We'll talk more about that later. Robert Doar has just been named as the new president, incoming president of the American Enterprise Institute. And he brings to that position tremendous experience in trying to work to overcome poverty. And it's an important voice at an important place at that. He was a big part of the Brookings-AEI study. Romanita Hairston-Overstreet, I've never called you by your last name before, was a colleague of mine working on the Convergence program. She is at Microsoft, helping connect that major institution with questions of work and the future. She also has been a leader for many years in the faith community, where I first came to know her at World Vision. And Ashley McSwain is actually on the front lines. While the rest of us have been in studies and reports, she has been helping women coming out of prison find work and the dignity that we're going to talk about tonight. So we have a remarkable group of people, different backgrounds, different commitments, but a common commitment to work. So my first question is, why should the dignity of work? Why should workers be at the center of American economic life? Why should it be a central priority for the nation? And what are the consequences if we don't do that? What are the human consequences, economic, moral failures that would come with that? And with that, why don't we just go down the line? We'll start with Robert.
Okay.
So why is this important? Why work?
Well, first of all, John, I want to thank you for inviting me and remind everyone here that when I first came to Washington 5 years ago, after spending almost 20 years working in social services in New York State and New York City, you were one of the very first persons that welcomed me to this town and sort of brought me into the public intellectual world. I wasn't quite ready for it then, but your welcome really meant a lot to me, and so whenever you ask, I will always come over to Georgetown and be with you and engage in these kinds of conversations, so thank you. I think it's important because it's important for the individuals who are out of work. You were right, we're at a pretty good time now. Unemployment's below 4%. It's been that way for a lot of the last 10 months, which is a good thing. It hasn't happened very often. And wages are rising, and they're even rising for people at the fastest for people with the lowest skills. So there's some progress, but there's still 1.4 million prime age males outside of the labor force and aren't even looking for work. And there's about 600,000 prime age women compared to the last peak in labor force participation in 2000. And for them, the absence of work is, first of all, it's an absence of a source of income that's very much needed for them and their families to move above poverty. It also relates to health. It relates to the dignity and their ability to be good parents and providers and be good community members. They're losing the social capital that comes from interacting with other people in a common effort. So it's really a tragedy. And a lot of what we do in the United States, whether you like it or not, in the safety net program, programs that you and I have worked on for so long, is contingent and leverages earnings by adding assistance on top of earnings. So the earned income tax credit, public health insurance, food stamp benefits, child care assistance, even housing assistance are most effective when they combine with at least some earnings to bring families above poverty. Absent of earnings, those forms of assistance aren't really enough. And so we have, we have good times in the economy, could be better, but pretty good. But we still have, we're still down in the percentage of Americans that are either looking for work or in work. And these are not just because of retiring. Prime age, off the peak, and we need to find ways to draw them in off the sidelines. And there are a lot of ways to do it, and I think we'll get into a lot of those discussions. Employers are very important. Government policy with regard to education and skills development is very important. And then and as someone who ran the SNAP program in New York City and Medicaid eligibility in New York City, I know that those programs, which are so important, have a relationship with individuals who could be working but aren't. And I think they could do more than just give a card and say, see you in a year. I think we could engage them more. I'm kind of an old social worker who thinks government can still do things when they engage individuals, and I'd like to get them to be more focused on getting people into work so they can then leverage not only wages, but these other forms of assistance and bring their families above poverty.
Thank you. We'll be talking about all that. Romanita?
Right. Thank you as well for being here. It's been a pleasure to work with you on a number of different things, and certainly good to be amongst this distinguished panel of participants. I want to pick up the conversation in the spirit of dialogue with the article you talked about why dignity in work should be disconnected, to just make a couple of philosophical points and then speak from the perspective of an employer, but also to speak from the perspective of a participant in Convergence. I often think of work as more than a way to make a living. It's a way to participate in society and to be a part of society. And one of the challenges when we disconnect dignity from work is that a real belief in dignity is one that makes it pervasive across all aspects of life, work just being one of them. And one of the things that I want to talk about in the age of disruption, where we say the machines are taking the jobs and maybe the machines should be doing the jobs, is that actually maybe we've been doing the jobs of the machines. And I actually want to talk about the power of human potential from the perspective of what we see in the nature of work. When we talk about lifting up the lowest income Americans and improving economic mobility, we're talking about significant structural challenges in the way we do education. For example, most of us will have at least 8 to 12 jobs, they say, whether that's in different careers or not. Lifelong learning is the way of the future. We need to skill almost 1 billion people in 9 months to be ready to be as productive as we might want to be as a society when we think about the future of where work is going, which is something at Microsoft that we're extremely interested in. Why do I make those points? I make those points because I think about the productivity that we all want isn't just in the nature of people being employed and how much they're paid. It's in the dignity that comes from the work that they do. And here in the age of disruption, one of the things that we have the best opportunity to do is see disruption lead to a real explosion of human potential. And I will just give a couple of things. In labs, we have grown the first human brains, the ability to potentially long-term cure things like Alzheimer's. We have the capacity to potentially desalinize the oceans and actually lead to places where we could actually deal with things that I dealt with in my 20 years at World Vision, like bringing water to the world. In order to do that, we have to have a workforce that is skilled. And what we have today is a huge pipeline of talented individuals who, if we believed in their abilities and their potential, we would then invest as a nation in their skilling. And what we would produce is not a fear of the jobs that machines would take, but we would open up the opportunity for the potential of human change in the world to solve major challenges that keep us down. But it requires the willingness, not just the ability, of government, of philanthropy, of employers coming together to help to make those changes. So I believe in improving the economic mobility of individuals, not just because it's right for them, not because of my inherent belief in what individuals can do, but because of what it means for all of us. And we have yet to come to truly believe that some of the greatest change that we can make will come from mobilizing the entirety of our workforce. It is hard for many of us to imagine a world with intense job shortage. But the reality is that as employers try to fill jobs in the US and around the world, those realities become true if we don't skill and build the capacity of workers to take on the jobs of the future. While 1/3 of jobs will go away, many people say many more jobs will be created. And I believe in a future through the work that we've done, the Convergence, through the work that we're doing at Microsoft, that is about lifting the human potential of all individuals in the workforce to be able to contribute in ways that lead to us fulfilling our societal potential as well as our individual potential.
Ashley, we've had a think tank, Microsoft potential. You deal with human potential.
Yes.
At the core. People coming out of prison, trying to keep their families together. Why is work so important? Why is the dignity of workers so important?
So thanks so much for having me. So work is the ground from which so many people that are being released from prison don't have. You know, they're so busy trying to figure out how do they demonstrate their value within this society that has sent them to prison. And one of the things about the criminal justice system is that, you know, we send people to prison, we exclude them from the workforce, and then we blame them for not working. And, you know, this dignity work provides anybody with something that they can be proud of. So many of the people that we serve are looking for spaces in which they can be proud and then they can be happy. It gives them purpose. You know, many people that are coming home have fines to pay, fees to pay. They don't have any way of doing those things, and those are their realities, whether they earn those, you know, or not. They have to pay those fines. And without work, they're lost. People are just lost. They don't have any guidance. They don't have any direction. And, you know, also when I think about dignity in work, I think about it's not just the work that is the dignity, it's the way in which they are valued and treated in the work. And that often gets lost when we start talking about work. I mean, you can't, send me to a job where I'm cleaning toilets and then treat me like I'm a toilet cleaner. There is no dignity in that. And so when I think about dignity in work, I think about allowing someone who's coming home from prison the opportunity to work and also treating them like what they do is dignified and valuable.
Thank you. Katie, you work for workers. What's your take on the dignity of both?
So first of all, thank you so much. It's good to be back at Georgetown. I graduated from the law school and actually was in this library for the founding of the Kalmanovitz Initiative, which focuses on labor and workers. And it was actually because of Joe McCartan, a professor of history here, that my past work in civil rights, where I really focused on individual liberties, I had my aha moment and looked at the world of work, the world of workers, and specifically the role of labor unions as institutions in our society. So yes, this is something obviously that we assume that work is dignified. That's a baseline for us. So it's hard for me even to get my head around a different perspective on that, but no one here, I think we're all in agreement. I mean, I think there are two aspects of the dignity of work that I wanted to pull out. One is simply the actual valuation of work, which I think when you think of a union and you think of bargaining across a table around wages, how do workers share in the wealth they create? How do they actually, their work gets valued as part of the outcome? So no matter whether the work is a janitor in this building helping to keep the institution sound and secure, so that others are then doing this public intellectual life, it's all connected. So I think there's literally the valuation of like how much do you get on the dollar. And honestly, productivity has been up over the last several decades. Wages have been flat. Unemployment numbers, the rate is down in terms of unemployment, and we're all for full employment. We have a bit of a different assessment in terms of wage growth. We haven't seen the wage pickup that you'd expect from low unemployment. Inequality in the economy is well documented. I'm not our policy expert, and you can go online and read the many reports. It's all out there. So I think we've all acknowledged at this point that there is this problem that we're not valuing work well enough. And so how do we fix that? And there's different policy solutions, and we in labor have a particular idea on that. But I think when you ask about the dignity of work, as labor unions, we're not just bargaining across the table because we're really good at negotiation. We don't just talk about the economy because it's an abstraction intellectually. As unions, we're in touch with, at the AFL-CIO, we represent 55 different unions, 12.5 million workers in every sector of the economy at every level of the income scale. But when you think about the dignity of work, it's universal. So I just got an email from my father 2 days ago saying that his cousin was dying and he was in hospice care. And my dad's cousin was asking him, his other cousin was asking, how are you doing? And he said, I'm pretty good. He had really good health care where he was staying. And he said, when you push a button, the nurse will come. He said, I can even ask for a priest. And when I push that button, I can even get communion on the other side. So for us every day, we think about, okay, that has nothing to do with work, his career, but it does have everything to do with work. His ability to have cared for his family over those years, his ability to have good health care, in addition to the social insurance that helped support it through the politics that his union had supported. There's so much that goes into the story of why that man had dignity in death, including access to his faith. So when we think about the valuation, we can all debate the numbers, but I think when we talk about the dignity of work, we're all on the same page, that there is a very core humanity to work that allows us to care for our families, care for ourselves. And by the way, there was a nurse on the other side of that buzzer who was doing a job there. And we hope that her work was valued while caring for him. And the priest had a chosen calling as well. And we all support that, through different institutions. So it's the two things I do want to say, though, in terms of thinking through this question. Why now was part of your question. So why now are we paying attention? This is an evergreen problem. This is an evergreen challenge. But I would say two things. One, globalization, the financialization of the economy, there's lots of different policy and economic forces at play. But one I wanted to highlight that we have been focusing on at the AFL-CIO is technology. And not so much that technology is either good or bad. We've been facing technological change for the last couple hundred years in the American labor movement, dealing with it better in some instances than others. But the pace of change, I think, is new in terms of the technology that we're seeing now. When you think about globalization, that was enabled by the ability of computers to talk to each other and share work plans and diagrams across countries' borders. When you think about financialization of the economy and the wealth of Wall Street, I went to University of Pennsylvania. I have a lot of Wharton grads as friends that are working on Wall Street. The ones that did the best were the engineers writing the computer code behind all of those different great ideas in banking. So you really have to think about how technology is escalating the pace of change, and not only that, but shaping the quality of the job, so that now you may not have a boss in the usual sense. A Microsoft executive actually said to me, every worker is a tech worker now. And it took me back at first, and I thought, come on, what about the home healthcare aid? Not much technology there until you think about the complex and massive data and algorithmic decisions that are made in the healthcare sector that control when that home healthcare aide does her job, where she does it, how the pace of the work, how many different clients she has to see, and it'll even evaluate the valuation of her hourly wage. So there's a huge and massive technological kind of complex behind jobs that we don't even think about. I think Uber and Uber drivers have made us all kind of aware of that. So I think technology and the pace of change is something we have to think about around the dignity of work. And then secondly, and this is why I sit inside the AFL-CIO, I think there is a real challenge of how do you include workers in the decision-making process as the pace of change quickens, both about big picture questions in the political economy, but individual questions about how they get their work done. What does it mean not to have a robot? We don't think that robots are going to take all of the jobs, but certainly work will change and shift. We saw it with the internet and email. Our own office administrators, we're having that conversation with them now about how their work has changed based on technology. So I think it's how do you account for the pace of that change, and how do you include workers and worker voice in that change? And again, that's why I'm in a union, is an institution that does that every day.
Thank you. Let me follow up with that. One of the, you're not only a Georgetown Law graduate, you were a professor at Georgetown, and if you don't know about the Kamenovitz Institute here on the working poor, you ought to. They do remarkable work. We share a hallway. They're a lot of fun, and you ought to get to know them. Working poor, the future of work, you're helping President Trump to deal with that. What does the future look like from a labor perspective where, as you suggested, the voice of workers needs to be heard? What is the AFL-CIO doing about the future of work? Where are you headed?
So the piece, I help staff something called the Commission on the Future of Work and Unions, which was the result of a resolution at the AFL-CIO's convention, which means that all 55 of those unions and all of our delegates said, this is something that you guys need to pay attention to. So it wasn't just something that President Trump came up with out of his head. And when you look back and you look at the resolution, in some ways it's a kitchen sink resolution. It talks about the economy. It talks about the need for training. It talks about the power relationship between working people and employers. It talks about technology. And so really it was a cry to say, we need to hit the pause button for a bit and really look at the landscape in front of us, both the economy and technology, our role as unions as institutions, and then how do we collectively, and that's where the AFL-CIO comes in, as a labor movement, think about these. And we spent many months drawing on a lot of the work that's already out there in terms of expertise, not to reinvent the wheel. But some of the questions we looked at was, okay, what is going on with robots? Like, should we be afraid? Is that something we need to really just think about the universal basic income because there won't be any more jobs left? So we really dug into the data and expertise to come up with essentially our own analysis and opinion on what was really going on. And I think that, a couple of insights. One, it's not just about technology, but also about bringing workers' voice into the mix more. And I think one of the, I would say there was kind of three challenges as we think about moving forward. Can labor unions effectively innovate to build solidarity among workers of the future? And when I say workers of the future, that means people will care about training and adapting to new changes in their workplace as much as they may care about healthcare right now. We also talked a lot about Fisher jobs, jobs where you're not just in one nice square block of the Ford Motor Company, but the fishering of jobs so that a piece of the job is done over here, a piece of the job is done over here. So how do we deal with that when workers are actually segmented and separated? And by the way, the diversity of the workforce. The workforce of the future does not look like it does today. So looking about innovation, how do we bring and use technology to bring workers' voices more to the fore? Social media is one example, and then finally, how do we make sure that the labor movement is a solution to histories of exclusion that you mentioned, racism, sexism, anti-immigrant status, rather than perpetuating those norms?
Mm-hmm. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical called On Human Work, I remember said, and this may not be exactly these words, but he said, unions at their best help workers not only have more, they help them be more, and by dealing with these issues. We just talked about race and sex. We talked about diversity. The flip side of diversity is racism and sexism. We're in the age of Me Too. You work with African American women. How does race and gender impact the women who are coming out of prison, the work you do every day? There may be a booming job market, but a lot of the women you're working with have the odds stacked against them.
Yeah, in many ways. The criminal justice system isn't structured to accommodate the needs of women. It was designed to respond to men. And so having a woman involved, and the numbers have arose almost 800% over the last 30 years for women. And so having a woman be a part of a system that wasn't structured to support her needs is extremely challenging. So what that looks like is that, there are so many women who are involved in the criminal justice system who've been victims of trauma and domestic violence. The system isn't set up to provide her with the kind of safeties and supports that she needs in order to heal. And so, she's got to deal with that. So many of the women that we serve are, primary caregivers of their children prior to their incarceration. The system isn't structured to ensure that she has communication access to her own children. So many of the women that we serve have not had a whole lot of work history. And women are very relational. And again, the system is very demanding, do what I say. Women don't work that way. They want you to conversate and communicate and share. And, this system that they're in just isn't and doesn't accommodate their needs. A large percentage of the population, more than is represented in the community, are African American women, women of color. And again, they come out and they don't have the supports and resources that men have. Gender is amazing when you start thinking about the criminal justice system. If you go to any prison on visiting day, the line to see a man is about 6 miles long. There are no lines to see women. Women just don't have the kinds of supports that men have in order to thrive and grow. And so work is the one opportunity for them to demonstrate that they are progressing and moving in their value. And this issue of race and gender, it permeates their experience at every turn. There are more African-American women in prison. There are more under supervision. There are higher rates of HIV. They have higher rates of domestic violence. I mean, you think about all the isms, and this population has a higher experience of those isms. And so, having a conversation that acknowledges that women are having a different experience, so that maybe you can design interventions that can address that different experience, is a really good place to start in terms of, making them whole and helping them get into the workforce. Because unfortunately, you have to deal with all these things first. Like I have to heal from the abuse in order for me to be a good employee. I have to, pay my fines and find housing and do all of these things until I can benefit from, the dignity of work.
You have a remarkable academic career. You have 2 degrees from Temple, 1 from American University. You teach at Catholic U. Our great source of pride is you're going to supervise Anna Misva, who is here running this thing.
That's right.
You're very lucky, so is she.
I am.
Let me ask an imprudent question. Me Too seemed all about Hollywood, maybe a little bit of corporate life. What's Me Too mean to women coming out of prison?
I think that Me Too is just acknowledging the kinds of experiences that women have had. So the Me Too movement gave voice to these stories and these experiences that women didn't feel like they could tell. And so if I'm a woman who'd been to prison, and part of my journey into prison was a result of my victimization, Me Too now creates an environment that I could say that without me sounding like I'm making excuses for the circumstances that I'm in. So while it looks like it's a Hollywood thing, it does create a space where the conversations can be had that just weren't comfortable prior to that.
Thank you. Romanita, we were together on the Convergence report. You're part of a Convergence study about reentry. We were together on one that's working up. We were the Sanity Caucus. We tried, actually you tried to pull people together. You have a remarkable place in that you sit in Microsoft, you come out of World Vision, you have your own consulting firm, you have been in philanthropy. A lot of what we said is folks got to work together to make this happen. It sounds to me like you've been getting people to work together on stuff. How could we get business, labor, philanthropy, faith, government to work together to lift people up in the way you described?
Well, some of it for me, I think, is about some of the philosophical assumptions we bring to the work. But what I liked about the convergence process is I think it was a process that was done the way you have to do them. How many people ever been invited to a cross-functional group to solve a problem? And you already know when you get there who you don't like, who you're not going to sit next to, the people you're going to huddle up with, right? Because you have a shared opinion. And I think that it is one thing to fight for human dignity, and it's another thing to believe in human dignity and practice the art of giving it and receiving it. And fundamentally, for systemic challenges, we need systemic solutions that bring all of the parties together who own some portion of that solution. And I'm not on a commercial for Convergence. I'm not paid by them in any way. But what I love about Convergence and the process that they bring together is it focuses on the participants in the way that they value each other's dignity and find ways to come to our shared view of the world, our shared beliefs in human potential. And often what you find in those rooms where we're divided on the basis of what we believe is that underneath it, there are some very real things that we care about that could bring us together. Not to solve every challenge and difference of opinion that we have, but to come together in very concrete ways around ways we can move the ball forward. And that becomes important, particularly when we talk about the world of work. And so I'll just say a couple things because you were all in the lane that I love to drive in on the future of work and learning. When we talk about these questions of discrimination, employability, I often like to say, is a twin engine with education. And if education opens a pathway for people out of poverty, employment is the car they drive. And the quality of that employment determines how fast they go, where they get to, and all of these kinds of things. And the last time we re-engineered work and learning was the Industrial Revolution. Here's the great benefit of that most people don't recall. It expanded work and opportunity for generations of people who did not have it. In the technical revolution, we have that same opportunity, but it required a major reworking of the system. We have to think about how do we skill people, and particularly people who are left out of the system. If the future of work and learning are changing and you're still living in the now of work and learning, how many more gaps does that create? And that should be the thing that is the impetus that brings us to these tables for conversations about the pace of change and the way that we need to work together to ensure that skilling can be done differently, to ensure that credentials can be given to people, to ensure that there are philanthropic pathways that remove barriers and social programs that help to create access and ladders of opportunity. And that's not anything that any one group can do on their own. And the only reason we'll fail is if we choose to not respond to the pace of how quickly things are happening to create those access points for others.
So, John, before you ask me a question, I want to comment on a couple of things that
Well,
they
wait,
said.
you get to
No,
comment after
no,
I
they're very, no,
introduce you.
this is not negative. This is positive.
I know.
This is, I want to say, Kate has made a very good point about how important it is for workers to be involved in their futures. And one way that we discovered in our report, or discussed in our report, that can happen is when it comes to training and education and skills development, they can have more choices. And the fact is that in the United States, we've done an awful lot to support education for a bachelor's degree. But we haven't really done enough to help people who want to get a certificate or go to a community college and get a trades apprenticeship. And that's one very fundamental policy proposal that allows workers to have a greater stake in their own choices and their own futures. And so I thought that was a great point, and I wanted to hit on that. Now, I'm all for helping women, and especially and including women coming home from prison. The programs that I worked in, public health insurance, SNAP benefits, EITC, TANF, were all very much focused, actually, on mothers with children. And our safety net programs are built to help households with children in them. And that's a good thing, and it's allowed women from low-income families to get into work and then supplement their wages with benefits that bring their families above poverty. And a lot of gaps between African-American women and white women have closed because of that. Some very interesting statistics about how African-American women particularly are doing much better than compared to African-American men. And I think that's an area that we have to really face up to, because our safety net programs are so targeted, I understand why, on households with children in them, that these single individuals who are often men who don't have kids and then can't get the added benefit that comes from an EITC and a low-wage job are kind of left out. And I think a real challenge, if we really want to address the absence of the dignity of work for so many Americans, is to focus on this group, because they've been kind of left behind. It's not that we should not do what we can have done for others, but there's a group that is, the gaps are widening, not closing. And this is something we have to face up to. So I just thought that both of the comments before got me thinking about particular problems that we addressed. A colleague and a friend of yours and a Georgetown professor, Harry Holzer, and I wrote a paper called Getting Men Back to Work, because it's just their prime age work, labor force participation is lagging, and we have to find a way to close that gap.
Can I just make a comment? Because having a criminal background is the barrier. So, gender, age, men, women, it's the social thinking around what it means for someone to have gone to prison. I mean, it's amazing to me that we can sit around and agree that marijuana isn't the worst thing that somebody could have did, and we throw them in jail for 30 years, we're letting them out, and then we're still judging them. I mean, having a criminal justice background is the biggest barrier that we have right now for African American men in the workforce and African American women who've been involved in the criminal justice system. So the conversation around dignity of work is extremely important. But how do you then create a pathway for someone who does have a criminal background so that they can get to this dignity that we're talking about?
And that barrier applies to white and Hispanic men as well.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter the color.
And this particular economy, that's why we want it to last even longer, because employers really are creating their own prison reentry programs because they're so desperate for workers. And when employers are desperate for workers, they'll finally take a chance on that person that has that difficult background. And so we really need to, keep that going for as long as we can, because it really does help get people into the labor force. I should also say that one way you make that connection, which is not done enough, is the social services network needs to connect with people coming home before they leave prison. And they need to get that, and I'm an old case worker, so I build cases. They need to start that assistance so that someone gets home and is already connected and doesn't have to muck around and find trouble and then go to the social services network when they're already when they're more in trouble. And that connection is so important. Now, the problem is that, in my experience, is the people who work in the incarceration side, that side of the state governments just are not as willing to partner with social services programs. But when they do, we get a better start on helping people come home.
I was going to offer a fulsome introduction before you offer those comments. I'll cut it short.
Yes, that's right. If you don't know me now, you're never going to know me.
Princeton. This is a big deal. Robert Doar is the new president of AEI. The last time we had the president of AEI at Georgetown, it was our poverty summit, Evangelical and Catholic Poverty Summit, where we invited the President of the United States to come, not to give a speech, but to be part of a panel on poverty. And the White House thought we were out of our minds, and President Obama agreed to come. And it was a panel and included President Obama, Arthur Brooks, who Robert will succeed, Robert Putnam, who had just written a book, and others. Our thought was, it's just one other parenthesis. One thing about Robert is he worked in the New York State Human Services work and the city of New York. So it's not, while he's running a think tank, he has more than thoughts. But the point about getting Obama and Brooks and others together is we thought, frankly, if we could lock people in a room for a weekend, we could come up with some common ground stuff. Maybe Convergence could help, or we could pray. If we locked us in a room, we could come up with a pretty good effort. I mean, I think there's been a lot of common ground.
Yeah.
If we locked up our politicians right now, no one would come out alive. How do we get the consensus and the work that these reports reflect into politics in a way that people stop scoring points with each other and start working together? And let's start over on this side. How can the labor movement contribute to that?
I mean, first of all, I would hope that the four of us could come to agreement. That's what the labor movement is trying to do every day, is we're sitting across from, we're not isolated in some kind of progressive bubble. Every day, like I said, in every sector of the economy, we are across from employers. We're across the table from politicians in different state legislatures. So I think that the way that the labor movement has been looking at this question is, on some level, and I would say that we are taking kind of, some measure of responsibility over this, which is that maybe we haven't been doing as good a job making sure that workers are at the table during these important conversations, in both kind of a two-way street of both educating and engaging workers, and connecting their voices into I would say that whether it's the halls of power or the tables that matter, to have these types of conversations. But also, quite frankly, we sometimes have trouble getting in the room. I think training is a good example where the labor movement spends, I think it's something amazing, like $1 billion a year on training programs. We're the second largest, kind of educational system next to, the university system in America. So we understand training in all kinds of sectors, particularly in the trades. But it's not always easy to get employers to kind of go in with us on the deal. And too often you see workers holding the bag to self-educate, whether that's figuring it out through an online application or paying out of pocket for the training. But I think that notion of partnership on something that we all agree is critical to the future of work, to the dignity of work, it does come down to kind of what rooms you're in and are we in a negotiation, or is this, are people willing to kind of go in together? Mm-hmm. And that is the trick, right? That I think we could come up with probably a really amazing training paradigm, but the question of how you structure it, both so that not only that workers have a voice, quite frankly, that employers have a voice. Too often in training programs, people get trained and then the jobs aren't there. There's a disconnect there, obviously, with the employers. Sometimes when community colleges take it on, they do a great job on the training, but they're not as sophisticated on kind of the economic side to make sure, how long will those jobs be there. So it's really, I think training is a perfect example where we look at it as a necessary dialogue between labor, employers, and government, that you've got to find that sweet spot. So the more we can think in that triangle, the better.
Yeah. We're going to come to you for questions in a moment, but let me try a couple more things. Both of you have been a part of processes to try and come up with an agenda. What are some of the pieces of that agenda, and how did people find common ground? If Sherrod Brown and Marco Rubio said, okay, we're going to call off the Twitter war, what are some things we might be able to do together, and pull AEI, Brookings, and Convergence group in the room? What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I am a little less cynical about how the politicians prevent real progress from happening in many cases, but a lot of these issues do happen outside of the radar or below the fray, and real progress does get made. We've just recently significantly increased child care funding, for instance. There have been other things that do happen, and sometimes one of the ingredients is to get it away from the headlines and all the attention. Another agreement, which we did in both of our studies, was to sort of agree on some basic facts and to start with an exercise about, well, what has happened in the labor force, what has truly happened with regard to wages over a long time, how has the safety net helped to shore that up or not, and then when you get that behind you, then you can, people can come together on things that can work. You have to have, it's helpful not to pull from the far extremes. I want to be honest. At least in our exercises, we didn't go all the way to the right and we didn't go all the way to the left. And because if we had, there would have been a much harder time coming together. And then you have to narrow your scope. I was also a part of the National Hunger Commission, which was a bipartisan report that we wrote unanimously. And we didn't try to do too much. We tried to do what we could and all agree to. And some people thought the report was a little, could have been more. But what we offered, and in fact, a strong emphasis on employment, I think did help move the ball forward a little bit. So those are some tips that I think have worked.
Romanita, what did you learn from our process or your other work?
Sure. Well, I'll answer it in two ways. One answered from the first question you asked, which is, how can we get our political process to move further? And I'm going to answer that more from an example of what I think Microsoft is doing as an employer. to do that. And so the first thing that I would say is, I think we're engaging in the political process to be a voice for those things that we care about. And as a company looking to not only do well as a company, but to also do good, we're thinking about the things that surround employability in our domestic and global programs that we do philanthropically to help to promote career pathways and to help to promote legislation that will be beneficial to have people be able to actually participate in the digital economy as we help to shape and change it as a company. I think the other thing that I would say is, and this is always going to be a little bit of my bent, our politics are also a reflection of our engagement or abdication in the political process. And I still do believe in the power of what individual voters are able to do when they become educated and demand more. And I think we need to continue to demand more as a society from the political process so that it can help us to all achieve our shared aims. With regard to the processes with Convergence, I think one of the things that was really beneficial from a process standpoint of bringing people together is starting at the point of vision and not just at the point of what we want to solve for. Because what you find is in the world we often want to create, I'm sure there are some people who are sort of end of the world apocalyptic in their thinking, but for the most part, we all envision a reality that in a lot of ways has places where it brings us together. And I really appreciated at the front end of the process was that. What I appreciate about the solutions, though, is that we came to things that felt practical for both sides. Things like looking at how we structure our tax system to think about how do you incentivize skilling? How do you help to decrease the fact that most families don't have more than $350 to $500 and that major disruption in their life throws them off of their financial pathway? And so what I would say about the process is it started at a big picture, but it led us through a process of affirming human dignity and being people in the process to getting to very tactical things that we could all come together around, like people need access to skilling in ways that aren't the traditional degree. People need relief from financial burdens that literally derail them. And we could look into the way we think about our tax system and go, we could all agree on those things because we all have this shared vision of greater employability. And that takes a lot of savvy. So I think the last thing I'm going to say is I don't think everyone who convenes a group of people with radical ideas should do it. So a part of it is we lock people in the room with the wrong people. And facilitation is a skill set, right? And it's based upon a set of principles and values. And so I would also go, I think we have to do more than lock ourselves together. We have to start to go inherent in the process is a skill set to help us get there, and how do we start to bring together people who can help us do that better?
Just one other thing is also get out of Washington. We took our reports to Grand Rapids, to Birmingham, to Cincinnati, to San Diego, and at the local level, so much is happening, and they are just much more receptive to efforts to come to common solutions, and they make a big impact. And I think we get a little too obsessed with the federal government.
The way I read your view is you're cynical about Washington like I am, but not about the locals. I did go to Minnesota. It was 25 below zero, and it just drove me nuts. Before I turn to Ashley one more time, just an example. I'm in the Convergence thing, and I am a vision person. I'm talking human dignity. I'm quoting popes. And it went over really well. And they said scheduling is a big damn deal. If you don't know a week ahead of time how often you're going to work, how many days, when it's going to be, you can't plan your life, your kid's life, your child care, when you're going to take the kid to the doctor. And we had Unite Hire and we had Walmart in the room. And the people from Walmart say, there's a way to do this 3 weeks ahead of time. And the other folks said, well, why don't you do it? And they said, well, we're going to try. And they said, why don't you hurry up and do that? I mean, some of this is grand vision. Some of this is people got to know when they have to go to work and how many hours they're going to have and whether they need another job. So you live on that practical level. If you were, whether it's in Washington or whether it's you deal with local government, what would be a practical thing that you would encourage people to do? And then we're going to go to the audience.
What is a practical thing that I would have providers do or government?
Government policy.
government has to somehow make the link between what they're asking people to do while they're incarcerated and how that then translates to work when they're released. You know, like people spend 8, 9 years inside a facility. They're cooking, you know, they're doing a specific skill, and then they come out into the community, and then they're not able to get employment in those fields. And so if government's going to do anything, there needs to be some ability to relax either licensure or policies or something that would allow me to do the work that you allow me to do in prison on the street. And the other thing I'd like to share is that, you know, as part of the Reentry Ready community, convening with Convergence, we brought stakeholders from all over with different opinions to think about how can we collectively address the needs of this particular population. And, you know, I'd never been a part of a group where there were Republicans in there and had their own idea and lens from which they viewed this issue. But I did find that everybody wanted the same sort of thing. You know, they wanted to see people, you know, get their needs met and feel supported. And I'm finding that, you know, this notion around the dignity of work, it's life or death for this population, believe it or not. I mean, you know, like, I'm gonna die if I'm not, you know, if I don't have work, because I don't have any other options. There are no mechanisms from which I can grow. And so, you know, work means something different to someone who's involved in the criminal justice system, who's trying to figure out how to be a part of this social contract that we all ascribe to. And it's been very challenging. Hopefully the Reentry Ready Committee will implement some of their policies and programs. And to your point, one of the things that committee will do is to make sure that people have access to people while they're still in custody in every state. Because we go in every single week, but we're in DC. It's not the case in every state.
Okay. Time for questions. We have a couple people with microphones. If you'd raise your hand, we'll find you. There's one over here. Young woman. If you could stand, so we...
Sure. Hi. I'm a master's student here at Georgetown. Thank you very much. I also was a worker before I was a master's student, though. And I was wondering, when we talk about the dignity of work, if we could talk a little bit about what we've been telling our young people, that your life purpose is going to be in your work. You're going to find fulfillment in your work. You're going to achieve your transcendence and your meaning through your work, and how a lot of young people of my generation aren't necessarily feeling that when we go to work, whether it's because we're feeling stagnant wages, we don't feel respected in the work that we do, even if we have a degree, especially in the information age and how much of our work is information. We feel a little bit more isolated. People are doing jobs very different from one another. They feel very isolated. We're not on the factory floor together in solidarity, making something, and then at the end we see the product of our labor. And how do we translate this idea of dignity and fulfillment in work to the information age?
Great.
I mean, just really quick, one of the areas of the economy where we have seen workers organizing is in digital news. And what I thought was interesting there was that, you know, it's somewhat unexpected. That wasn't, there's certainly unions organizing there, but there's also been a lot of, it's been building on itself. And I think it feeds into a lot of the themes that you were talking about. But at least from our perspective, the dignity of work isn't just about work. It's what I'd said before about, it's the spillover effect and the ability to have a family or not. Care for your family, care for your community, be able to practice your faith. I mean, I think that the dignity of work is about not just the workplace. And one of the, I think, big challenges for us in the labor movement is how are we relevant to a generation that, you know, maybe your parents weren't in unions like mine were, that you don't have the same connection or understanding of kind of what you get with that union card. But like I said, the people are kind of naturally finding each other. And for example, our Secretary Treasurer Liz Schuler just went out to San Francisco to a big gaming conference of workers that design video games. Billions of dollar industry, and they're talk about not dignity of work. Their quality of work is very low, and they are not sharing in the gains of what they create in these video games. so that people are finding each other. And like I said, one of our challenges, I think, moving into the future is we have a very formalized set of institutions in labor. And how can we learn from some of the digital activism and kind of the coalescing and coming together through collective action that young people in particular are engaging in, whether that's Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement or the gamers out in San Francisco creating their kind of worker center of gaming technologists. I think one of the pieces is that someone is very open to that personally. There is a reason why our institutions are somewhat formalistic, and that is because they're democratic. People pay dues to belong, so there's real skin in the game. You need to leverage that collective power in sophisticated ways, whether it's with employers or in politics and in policy. So there is a reason why the institutions get a little rigid, because they do have to be accountable back to the members that are paying in. So that when you start to think about, what might be more loosey-goosey forms of collective action, I think one of the questions is, how do you, what we think of as not yet union members, how can we think about maybe not such rigid structures around membership, that there might be other circles that we could build out to accommodate, I think, a lot of young people who are feeling all of those things, but don't necessarily think union first, or don't want to be in a really formal institution.
Well, transcendence in work. It's not only young people who seem to be losing meaning. You look at life expectancy, it's always been worse for African American and Latino workers, but now it's actually declining for white workers, suicide, opioid. I mean, it's one thing to be head of a think tank or a big shot at a labor movement or Microsoft, or even saving people's lives. You said life or death. For a lot of people, that's not what they're doing. How do we share, for those of us who believe that work is ennobling and a source of dignity, how do we help people understand that?
Well, I think you make a good point, and I don't know that we have gotten there yet. I think this is a part of one of the questions around the future of work and the nature of the way work is changing as work becomes, one, less place-bound, right? There's a future of work where work can be done anywhere, less with people, and so I think you're raising all of those good points. I think the point that you started with, though, is where change happens. It's around the narrative of work, and I think this is a little bit of what the conversation has been thus far, is work the end unto itself, and not that work should not have inherent value, not that work should not bring happiness or have joy or have a quality to it. I think there's also the question of what is work enabling in our lives and what is our orientation. And that is not just a collective societal question, it's an individual and a very personal question. And it is a thing that it is hard to get away from at the individual level. There's not a global, systemic, or national solve to the question of do I work at work as an end unto itself, or does work enable a greater life purpose? I enjoy my work at Microsoft, but I'm wired to serve. And work enables me to have a broader engagement in the world. And so I think some of what you raise is also about some of the ways that our society has been disrupted, right? I would say if you look back into the Industrial Revolution, the nature of work wasn't just that work brought value, it's what it mobilized for family and community and education, and the deep values we had in those things, which we have to all be honest that those things are lost. And this is where I'll wax more philosophical than probably the point of why I'm up here. But I think it becomes the question to us as a society around what do we want to hold in the notion of work. Most people think, for example, that gig work is something that's not beneficial to people. When you look at a number of gig workers, in a report I saw said 88% of them enjoy it because of the freedom it gives them for the rest of life. And I think the question has to become, what are we thinking about around the course of our human society and what this generation will deliver? And unlike many societies prior to us, there were what I would call ennobling pursuits that brought a generation together, and I don't know that we have those. And so that's way more philosophical than the question that you asked, but I think it's around solving from some of these things in work, but we've got some bigger cultural fish to fry to get to some of what you're talking about.
I also think that, young folks want to be heard. You know, like they go to work and they're following everybody's instructions, and they have something to say about how things get done. And, you know, if there is a way that we can create a space where the people that are working for us, not only are they doing what we ask them to do, but we're doing some of what they want us to do. And if you feel like you're contributing to the outcomes of that organization, then you're more inclined to be a little more satisfied in your work instead of being, you know, very robotic where you're following instructions. I'm working with a young sister right now, and she wants to share. She got something to say, and we're making spaces for her to have something to say so that we can take action based on her voice. And when those things aren't present, because the work environment is very old school, you know, I mean, things are different, and the way in which work happens hasn't caught up. So, you know.
If they have something to say, we might have to listen.
Oh, yeah, and you might actually have to do something different.
Oh, we can't have that. Over here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7. Let's take 2 or 3 at a time, and then we'll ask the panel. Let's go over here.
Hi.
This isn't directed at you. It's my standard line. Please put your question in the form of a question.
Sure. My name is Cameron Meek. I'm not a student at Georgetown, but I have a very fulfilling job being this young lady's boyfriend. But,
Here, here.
so we mentioned UBI briefly, and it's been debated to death, but there's also organizations like the Levy Institute that are talking about a jobs guarantee. And it occurred to me that the present company might have some interesting philosophical ideas about what it means for work to be guaranteed, or that proposition.
Sure.
So would love to know
Thank
what
you.
you think.
Behind you, there. We're going to collect a few of these and then stand up.
Hi, I'm Zach Ruddick, a student at the McDonough School of Business. As we're discussing, and we briefly mentioned the kind of unquestionable rise in wealth inequality that's been occurring over the past several generations, as it becomes more and more extreme, the differences between passive income and earned income, how can we address that, and how can we think about the dignity of work and what it means, whether someone's earning earned income versus passive income, and are there ladders of opportunity to expose a broader percentage of the population to the possibility of earning passive income?
Okay, and behind you.
Hi, I'm David Jimenez. I work at a think tank in DC. I guess my question would be for Ashley and Robert. Obviously, over the past 40 years, the center-right and organized labor have had more than a cool relationship with each other. I'm sure economists at most conservative think tanks reacted very differently to the Janus decision than your colleagues at AFL-CIO. So I guess my questions to Robert or Ashley would be, what steps would you hope either your side takes or the other side takes to obviously not resolve all those tensions and ambiguities, but at least get the conversation going again?
Okay, so 3, take your choice. How are you going to stop fussing with each other and agree on something? What about not just universal income, but guaranteed jobs? And what about the rest of us earning passive income? Wouldn't that be dignified?
So I'll start on the first 2. Our group, I think both of the groups, but especially the second group on the working class, uniformly took a sort of negative view on both guaranteed jobs and universal benefit. That was not what we thought would be the most effective way to help people move up and increase opportunities for working class Americans. I think was a sort of unified resistance to the ability of the federal government to run a guaranteed jobs program. I would say in my own experience in New York City, we did have certain programs where we offered people who were receiving assistance jobs, and in a targeted way, in a limited way, that was useful. And it's also true if you offer someone an employment opportunity and they're receiving assistance and they decline it, our groups were unanimous in agreeing that the benefit should be at risk if they decline the opportunity. So that would be that on that. On the universal benefit, the principal argument that I think is the strongest against it is that universal benefit would take up all the resources that we have, plus that we currently use to serve the safety net. It would really end up being talk about transfers up and down. It would really be a transfer of a lot of money we spend on the bottom up through the rest of the economy, and I don't think that's what we're at or we're focused on. So, and I don't really know much about how to regulate or limit or increase passive income, so I better pass on that one.
Anybody else want to jump in? Okay, we had a bunch over here.
Oh, I will, yeah.
Okay.
Sure, and I'll say a few things. I think for me, this question of guaranteed jobs is more connected to what I would say is guaranteed skills. The reality is the future of work is around skilling. It's about having 21st century skills that are transferable to different types of work. And we could orchestrate an entire system for jobs, but 65% of elementary students will do jobs that don't exist. I don't think we've done the systemic work that it takes to be prepared for the future of work and learning. And so for me, I think the principle or what fundamentally underlies the notion of guaranteed jobs is an important principle to embody, that we want that for individuals. But I think when we start talking about what we need to guarantee for people to be prepared for the future, it's the skills that will allow them, that are evergreen, that will allow them to be ready for the world of work as it changes. As it relates to passive versus earned income, without trying to be an economics major, which my son is, but I am not, for the few economics courses that I took, I will say this, ultimately it's about changing the reality of ownership in America, right? Because what we own is often where we produce what is most of the kinds of income that we're talking about. And the reality of wealth transfer is related to all these systemic things that we're trying to solve. And so while this is not the point of this question, it gets back for me to what are the systemic changes that we're making that allow for individuals to have the kind of economic mobility that will lead to greater income. And I think a number of the questions that were talked about earlier around how do we start to think about how work is valued? Because if the reality for low-income workers today is that $350 will disrupt my life, passive income is a long way from that, which means we do have to think about how do people share in the profit that they create, and how do we create systems and safety nets that allow people to not be completely derailed over very small amounts of cash. And employers, government, and philanthropic and social organizations can all take an even share in helping to create some of the stability that leads to the possibility of earning. And then my last comment on the Janus decision is, I fundamentally believe in choice. I think having watched how some of these things played out on the ground, what I would say is workers need to be informed, right, about the choices that they're making. I think that that's important, but I think the service is what for me would be the sad thing is not the question of how workers get to make the choice, it's whether they're being fully informed about what opting in or out of groups mean for them, because there are important things that come from membership that in some cases workers have decided to not take because they didn't realize what they were giving up, and in other cases workers really did not need to make that choice and didn't need to have to make the choice. And so for me the question becomes, how do we center not on whether being a part of unions or other things are good or not, but how do we help to educate the workers so that they can make the right choice for them? And I think that's something that we would all believe in and want.
Say real quick that I'm not sure about guaranteed employment, but I do think there should be some kind of guarantee of access. So if I get out of prison, just guarantee that you'll give me an interview if we can, figure that out. And so, I'm not sure how you guarantee people employment. That's a lot of connecting and skill building and those kinds of things. But if we can do something that makes people able to get interviewed, I think that would go a long way.
Katie?
I'll just be quick because I know there's other questions. In terms of universal basic income, just the very first question, I don't think we're there yet. Universal basic income presumes, number one, that there won't be jobs, and at least in the experts we've been talking to, it's a little more complex than that. Jobs will still be there. Pieces of jobs may be gone. So how do people train into new skills they're going to need? So I think that UBI, at least in terms of the folks that have talked to me about it, have come out of Silicon Valley, and I think they're jumping many, many steps down the road based on assumptions that we don't necessarily agree with. And I also think, by the way, that we do believe in the dignity of work, so we think work is good. So we don't really imagine a time that we won't be working, and full employment hasn't gotten there yet. Number two, in terms of passive income, I'm not exactly sure if I'm understanding that term correctly, but one of the things that labor does is we do pool capital ourselves in the form of pension, money. So we actually do invest our pension dollars according to standards that we like to abide by in terms of good for workers type of thing. So we do actually amass capital, and I think that's something that is very much a power tool, and one of the things we can do collectively. And then finally, in terms of the right-left question, I think that for us, if you go, and again, the reason I keep referencing our resolutions is that it's not a nonprofit where I'm like the ED and just kind of make up a rule. We actually have these resolutions that guide our work that were voted on by our delegates, and they represent workers. So one of them was called essentially political independence. And it was a reminder to all of us in the labor movement that we are looking through the lens of workers. So it's not a question of right or left. We are going to follow that trail where it takes us. In some instances, that will put us in opposition to the right wing. For example, in Janus, where there was a threat to our public sector unions, which, by the way, there was kind of headlines about the death of the public sector union, which hasn't come to be, because workers like their union, and they get value at it, and they've stuck with it. But also, it has put us in some odd company in terms of the trade debate. That we were in opposition to President Obama. We've been across a table with President Trump. So we, I think in the 2017 resolution, really made a commitment that we are independent organizations, not political parties, but we will represent working people.
Okay. Bunch of questions over here. Anna, if you could pass the mic around. We'll collect a few, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Hi, my name is John. I'm a MBA candidate here at Georgetown. Quick question: when you look kind of macro level at business, it could be said that it's all about productivity and efficiency, and that's what drives business forward. And unfortunately, in the last century, we've been introduced to layoffs and stuff like that. And so it could also be argued that it is not healthy and it's not right to expect the government to deal with all of the issues and the byproducts of business productivity and efficiency. So my question is, do we feel like there's enough being done? And Romanita hit on it briefly with respect to Microsoft, but across all industries, do we feel like there's enough being done on the part of corporations, on the part of businesses, to take some sort of ownership in the way ahead with respect to the workforce and with respect to economic changes in the labor force as well?
Thank you. I saw one other back there.
I'm Jack. I'm currently an undergrad in the School of Foreign Service here, and I guess my question would relate to what we all have seen with the shrinking middle class, shrinking numbers in traditional unions, and these jobs oftentimes being replaced by new technology. We've mentioned the rapid scope and size of the current industrial revolution we're in. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. And I guess my question would be, how would you maintain dignity and ethics in an environment where we were dealing with technologies such as artificial intelligence, which oftentimes really doesn't think in the way that humans do, thinks very logically, and how this has been so pervasive, and how do you, I guess we've also talked about transitioning and retraining labor markets, but what are some concrete measures I guess you guys would think to establish to get ahead of this trend and to answer for these I guess indignities in the workforce and the potential for failure there?
There were two others I saw, there and there and there. We're going to make this really quick. The short version of your question, and then we're going to wrap up. Here you go. You have the mic.
There's one assumption you've made about the so-called social contract. There used to be an unwritten social contract in this country that a working man should have an income adequate to support his family in modest comfort. That's been undone, and it was done by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board in 1974, which sets the policies for the FDIC and FHA and veterans' mortgages. Before that, only the primary breadwinner's income was allowed to get a federal guaranteed mortgage. It allowed the second breadwinner's income to be counted. In the 3 years between 74 and 77, the price of housing in the Washington area went up 50%.
Okay.
All right, and then, so that meant that all the families where the mother wanted to stay home and take care of the children could no longer do that.
Okay.
They were forced to go to work. And I'm trying to say, look at the consequence now. An apartment costs $1,500 a month minimum. Even if we had $15 an hour wages, that's $30,000 a year. That's 60% of their gross income.
Okay.
So unless we address those structural problems, you can talk about work all you want. But we're grinding the lower class down into the dirt. The fact is the private sector cannot provide housing for low-income people. We better face that issue.
Okay. Back here, and then one more back there.
John, you had mentioned on human work, and so I'd like to bring us back there. For me, the key point is where John Paul talks about the inversion of capital and labor, where what has happened in our society, also in the Soviet Union and the communist system, but in capitalism, in both, it's a critique of both, that capital has come to control work. Ownership matters, and workers are just an object. They're in economics, they're just another means of production. That's the way that they think about it. And so how can we change that? There are ways, of course. Labor unions, of course, is one way to gain control back in some ways. Worker-owned enterprises, small businesses, there are many different ways. And what we've seen when that's deteriorating, it actually hurts productivity.
Yep.
You can show, econometrically, that when workers have more power, more control, more decision-making, because they're on the shop floor, they can make things run better and smoother and more efficient. And just want my question, because you asked for questions, is
I knew you'd get there.
What do all of you think about that?
Okay. All right. Last but not least.
So much. My name is Larissa. I'm with Sojourners. We're a national organization working for Faith in Action for Social Justice based here in DC. And my question is around education. You all have danced around this, talking about skill building and training. I'm the mother of a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, and one thing that has always stuck with me is when I heard the CEO of Moonshots talk about the jobs of the future, and I can't even probably imagine most of the jobs that might be available to my children. And what is the relationship of our education system and our ability to or not to invest in that, and the relationship between that and the dignity of work that you all have been talking about? Because the reality is that unless our children are trained to think critically and innovatively and creatively, the jobs that are going to be available to them, they're not going to be prepared for. So I'm wondering if you all could speak to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just one thing, raising a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old is dignified work. It'll test you in every way. So we've got a lot to choose from. Capital, labor, education, the future of work. Is the private sector going to own up to this? So here's the deal.
We got housing.
Housing, yes. You get to pick one or all of those and add a closing comment, and you get 2 minutes. So let's start with Katie.
So I'll start with the last point. As part of the Future of Work Commission, a bunch of union presidents and union staff went up to Carnegie Mellon University and met with their robotics professors and their AI professors, and it was an amazing sort of day where they toured us around to the future in terms of technology. And we asked one of the PhD candidates that gave us a tour of the 3D printing lab, I said, so where are you going to be in 5 years? And he said, in a job that doesn't exist yet. And this is going to go to Jack's question and to the question in the back. Obviously, we do think that workers and capital are out of whack, and I think that unions are the foundation for changing that. But putting that aside, since we're in an academic institution, I think that academia has a very important role to play here on a number of levels. When we went up to Carnegie Mellon, what we were talking about is a partnership and trying to get in on the action, essentially, that in private universities and public universities, there's all kinds of money pouring in to come up with the next AI and the next technology that's going to shape work and impact workers and advance capital. And what we had discovered is that there's a lot more what might be called public-private partnership happening inside the institutions, and labor workers' voices are nowhere to be seen there. So I think in a very basic way that academia is accepting all kinds of money, whether it's, and it's not bad necessarily, but doing collaborations with the private sector to come up with technologies of the future. In that process, I think there's a slow movement towards including workers in that. So for example, today I just read an article about Stanford working with a venture capitalist on an AI project for hospitals with NICUs, right? What better service could AI provide than to help kids in a NICU and help nurses care for them? So they wanted to do this project with nurses. It was like, wow, we should actually include nurses as we start to figure this out. And they did, but it was difficult, they said, because the venture capital firm had a tight timeline. They wanted to see a quick return on investment, and involving workers takes a little more time. And so that is something that academia needs to force this conversation with their partners, and as you develop these technologies. And just one last example, we were up at Carnegie Mellon, and they showed us technology around nursing. And we had the nurses union there. And the the president of the nurses union raised her hand and said, hey, by the way, did you think about this when you were developing that? And the professor, obviously quite smart, said, no, gosh, we hadn't. So it's not a question of intelligence, it's not a question of degrees, it's a question of who's in the room. So I think that that's one place, very concrete, practical place to start. I think Georgetown just got $55 million to do an AI institute, so you could start there.
We'll take a third of that. Ashley?
So I'm thinking about the fact, so I'm looking at everything from the lens of someone who's incarcerated. And this idea that technology is taking over so many jobs, it's also leaving behind a whole bunch of people who don't, know how to access technology in the way that it's being structured today. I mean, I had a young sister, she came home and she had said she had heard about that you could download, and she said, well, download from where? This is the way that we operate now. And we forgot that when you're in prison, the world keeps moving, but you're not moving with it. One young lady comes home and she heard about email. And so she's gonna email the mayor. And she just kept putting his name in the to line, and she could not figure out, why is this not sending? It's basic. But people that are incarcerated are being left further behind. So when we start thinking about work and the dignity of work, you have to figure out a way to include this group of people who's going to be returning to the community that you and I live in. And so one of the shortest answers would be to provide some computer training while they're still in custody. I mean, that's the quickest fix. But there are so many other avenues that need to be addressed, because the world is moving without a whole segment of the population. And the more we incarcerate, the more people we're leaving behind. And even when you start thinking about, okay, we could even guarantee them work, but they don't have the skills, or they don't even know the language. So they don't even know which questions to ask so that they can get ready. And so, we have to figure out, how do we include this entire population as we are evolving around technology?
Robert?
So I agree that corporations can do more. I think they've been excessively focused on investors and not enough on employees as well as customers. And investors and customers have got a lot of treatment. They keep prices low and they reward their investors, but they haven't thought as much about employees. And I think pressure on corporations and bully pulpit. The president likes to say, buy American, hire American. He keeps pressure on American companies to promote their employees and train them more. I think that's good, and I would like to do more of that. I absolutely agree. Skills development and training and education is really very much a part of this scenario and something we have to work on. I happen to think that we need to allow for greater kinds of skills development that isn't necessarily always a bachelor degree for everybody. And I think the housing question is a really important one. I think as wages didn't rise as much as we'd like, certain costs went up really dramatically. Housing went up, healthcare went up, and education went up. And those put lots of people in a real pinch. And I think one of the problems is, and President Obama's Council on Economic Advisors wrote a report about this, is local regulations and requirements and building codes that prevent the private sector from being able to build affordable housing for working people. We have at AEI a scholar who works on something called the Wealth Building Home Loan. He tried to do a whole project on working American housing, and what got in the way were the local restrictions and requirements that made it so much more expensive to build acceptable housing for working people. So that's something we have to face. The last thing I do want to say is I want to relate this to Ashley. Some of the questions we've had here talk about the challenges for middle and upper class Americans in work and the challenges of the changing workplace and artificial intelligence and feeling committed at work. The others, the ones that you and I are more familiar with, talk about people who are really struggling and are at the bottom, who are coming home from prison, who had children before they were ready, teenage moms, people on public assistance. And I would urge us, as we think about these solutions, to focus on the group most in need. That's where our real problems are. I hate to say this, but I have a feeling that middle class and upper middle class Americans will do all right. But people who are really struggle, we need to focus on them.
Bring us home.
Great. And I'm going to try to tackle all the questions and in 2 minutes. So, do businesses need to do more? Yes, but businesses are also doing more already. The reality is that companies need to solve for their talent shortages. And so there's a number of inventive partnerships happening anywhere, any place you can think of in the country between academic institutions, governments, and others to do that. The problem is we don't have scalable models yet. And we have to learn and we have to crawl before we can walk. And what we're really looking for is those innovative solutions that can be driven to scale to meet the needs of those who are farthest out from being able to capitalize on the solutions. So do employers have a role to play? Absolutely. To the question of artificial intelligence, we're really scared of the machines, but what we're learning about the machines, if you were to take the example of the facial recognition software that often misses minority people and doesn't quite recognize them, is the machines are often in their programming a reflection of us, because who programmed those machines? White men, right? And what you find actually in some of these tests is that after you correct for what we put into them, the machines get better than us at some of it and actually can be pathways to deal with human bias, which we bring to everything because we are people who naturally have that. And so on the future of work, 4 stats, 10 to 20-year job cycles where new jobs will be created. 65% of elementary students will do work that does not exist. 75% of jobs in the next 10 years will have technology. And then there is the rule of thirds. Most economists would say a third of jobs will go away, a third of jobs will change, and a third of jobs will be new. The question is, what is our perspective on what change will bring? And I want to say my perspective is that change will bring opportunity if we choose to maximize the opportunity and to create these new points of access, to create new ways for people to be heard, workers, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, employers, and schools. At the end of the day, if we're going to deal with what I really love and the passion that you said, it is hard to imagine a world where people work 3 jobs and can't take care of their families. That should bring us to tears, right? Because that is not a philosophical question. It is a human question of dignity, right? And it should feel egregious to us that we have not solved for that. And I think if we're going to bring together all the actors and the technology that will help us make that kind of change, we're going to need what I'm going to just label as N3. We need new tables, new places where conversation happens, we need new narratives, and we need new models. And we need models that are scalable to affect change. We need local and we need national things, but ultimately we're going to have broad scale and massive change. We need things that we can all get around in major ways, and that has been the tipping point for every revolution that we've had, is getting from the local to the global in a way that can be sustained over time.
I have a long list of people to thank, which I'm going to not do because there's reception out there. I had a wonderful closing question, and I'm not going to share that. We'll discuss it out there. But I really want to thank our partners, Bread for the World, Convergence, and our friends at American Enterprise Institute. There are lots of people who helped. 2 people made this happen. Kim Daniels, who is our associate director. And I don't understand artificial intelligence, but I do understand Anna has real intelligence. We have done 2 major dialogues in 2 days, and it took Anna and Kim and the rest of the folks to pull that off. So join me. A few coming attractions. On April 9th, we're doing a session with the law school on the law and the sexual abuse crisis, how law and lawyers help hide and uncover the clerical sexual abuse crisis, that evening at the law school. In April, we're doing one marking the 6th anniversary of Pope Francis, the Francis Factor, where his leadership is challenged, where it's breaking through. We have a program we do called Salt and Light Gatherings with young leaders. We're going to have a session in the Capitol on politics as a vocation with leaders from both parties and both chambers. Join us for that. We're going to have a session with our Latino leaders on immigration, and in June we have a major convening with an evening session on lay leadership in a broken church and a divided nation. Let me close with this, and it goes back to the theme. First of all, how remarkable is this to have new president of a think tank, big shot from Microsoft, a woman who's saving lives on the front lines, and a leader of the labor movement, finding areas to push us forward. I want to go back to Robert's last point. Some of the people in the room, we met with the President of the United States to talk about these issues. And there was a bishop from New Mexico, Ricardo Ramirez, and he said to President Obama, he says, I know you're a Christian, but you seem to have a different Bible in Washington. In my Bible, it says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. Apparently, the Bible here says, whatever you do for the forgotten middle class and the wealthy and the powerful, you do unto me. And the president looked at him and said, I think you've got us on that. I think what we have to talk about is not only the dignity of work, not only the dignity of workers, but the duty of all of us to lift up the least of these so that we are the community that Dr. King called us to be. Thank you very much. And there's a reception right outside.